Thanks for listening and supporting the Fall Line. We want to share a piece of news about another show that you might enjoy. Fall Line host Laurah Norton and producer Maura Currie have launched a new independent podcast called One Strange Thing. It's a compact, immersive narrative show that explores mysterious local news stories from all over the United States about regular people, just like you and me, who have had extraordinary experiences that can't quite be explained. Please stay tuned for just a moment to hear the promo now, then head over to One Strange Thing and subscribe. You can find a link in our show notes. We all enjoy a little mystery. And on the new podcast, One Strange Thing, that's just what you'll get. Every other week, One Strange Thing presents forgotten stories from America's news archives. They all have something in common, a single element that can't quite be explained. These are bizarre events that unfolded in our country's local newspapers, but never made it much further than that. I'm Laurah Norton. Join me on One Strange Thing, and you'll hear about a class ring that disappeared on one continent and reappeared on another, and the ominous whistling that terrorized a young bride in Louisiana, and the chemical warfare once waged on a sleepy town in Illinois, and the mysterious hum that's rattling Anchorage, Alaska. And then there's the house in Atlanta that once dripped human blood. And that's just the start. No matter the place or the people, One Strange Thing brings you stories that are very real and just a little otherworldly. Join us on September 8th to hear the first episode of One Strange Thing. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. This is the Fall Line. This is the second half of our long-form interview with Dr. Amy Michael, forensic anthropologist and lecturer at the University of New Hampshire. We pick up where our last episode left off, a discussion of Dr. Michael's most memorable and affecting cases. You've been involved in a number of fascinating cases in the past few years. Can you talk to us about a few of them?
Sure. I think that probably the most personally satisfying case, for a number of reasons, that I've been involved in lately is the case of Joseph Henry Loveless, or Clark County John Doe, Idaho John Doe, known by a few different names. This was a case that when I got a job at Idaho State University in 2017 as a visiting assistant professor, I walked into the lab on the first day and there was a nearly complete body laid out, skeletonized human remains laid out on the lab table. And I asked my colleague at the time, well, what's up with this case? It was very apparent that there was no head, there was no skull at all, but basically everything else was there with the exception of a few things. And he explained the story to me that in 1979 and again in 1991, parts of this man's body were found. We were certain it was a male from the physical remains. The remains have been found dismembered in this remote Idaho cave in 79 and 91. And just, it had the case had made it all the way to the Smithsonian. You can read about it in Doug Ubelacker's book Bones. He's a famous forensic anthropologist. And it was just, part of it was that there was no head ever recovered, and the head is a really identifying part of the body, as we all know. And another kind of probable reason why the case had not been or made any real movement or been resolved is because, after 1991, people essentially stopped working on it. And at Idaho State, it became kind of this teaching specimen for students. So many students have practiced a biological profile, estimating age and sex and stature and ancestry on these remains. But, it was sort of treated as, this is an impossible case. There's no head. It's very old. lots of people over the years had searched the cave for any other remains, notably, obviously, the head, and they'd never been found. And the cave had been lidar'd, so there was all kinds of like great work done on it. And I'd love to compile a list of everyone over the past 40 years or whatever that has worked on the case, because it's tons of people. It's not to say that nobody cared. Certainly they did, but I think that when I walked in and I heard that story, I was like, I really need to, like, I want to take my shot at this. And I had always been sort of a fan of what the DNA Doe Project was doing. I thought, well, this is a really challenging case. They seem to take on challenging cases. So I sat on it for a year, honestly, because I got involved with teaching and other casework in Idaho. And but I always thought about it, and it wasn't actually until I left Idaho State for my job currently at University of New Hampshire that I got in touch with a colleague again at Idaho State and said, hey, do you want to submit that to DNA Doe Project? I mean, like, the worst they can tell us is no. And by that time I had made friends with two forensic genealogists, Lee and Anthony Redgrave, and they encouraged me to do it. And so long story short, this case took a turn that I don't think any of us ever expected. Idaho John Doe was revealed to be Joseph Henry Loveless. The story went pretty viral. We were interviewed for New York Times and everything. And I had been looking at this body for a year, looking at the dismemberment marks, feeling like, man, somebody murdered this man, cut him up, put him in a cave, to be found who knows how long later, because we didn't have any idea when he died, of course. But kind of the going hypothesis was that he was probably killed sometime in the 60s, and that's because his remains, when they were found in 79, were still mummified. And so nobody really thought, with the mummified soft tissue present, that he could have been dead for much longer than 10 years. Now, the caveat to that is that some clothing was recovered with him, and the clothing did look old. But, the body didn't. And so this kind of sum total of factors added up, plus the very long time since discovery, plus there were some missing elements over the years, that had gone to the FBI and never returned, and things like this, which is not uncommon in old cases. It just all felt kind of like, God, it was almost like we had to start from scratch, So enter the forensic genealogists, who it was my opinion that, there was no more anthropology you could throw at this case. Like, we knew what we knew. We had an age estimate. We had a sex estimate. We had a trauma analysis. Let's try something else. And so the sheriff agreed to it, and we sent some remains off to be sampled for DNA sequencing. And I think it was about 4 months after the genealogist started working on it that they narrowed in on a possible identification. That was confirmed through a DNA swab of his closest living relative. And when I heard who his closest living relative was and the age of this person, which was 87 years old, I was like, oh, holy shit, we have a case that is way older than we thought. So to my knowledge, I think this is Joseph Henry Loveless's case is the oldest forensic identification to be resolved using genetic genealogy. It was a 103-year-old homicide. What we found out in addition about Loveless's life was also very interesting. I thought it's like a Wild West tale. I got a little bit of flack for this on the internet after I did an interview, and I said, I'd been advocating for this man to get identified, and people kept asking, well, are you disappointed? Because it turns out he was a murderer himself. He killed his wife, and he went to jail for that. He escaped jail, and then he was never seen again. So he was killed by somebody, but again, he was a killer himself. And so people kept asking, well, are you disappointed that you identified a murderer? And I was like, that's I guess I understood why they were asking that, but at the same time, I thought, well, all I saw was a dismembered human body on a table. That's what I cared about, and I wanted to find out who he was, because, I still think we can't mete out justice unequally. I mean, we can't just resolve the cases of quote-unquote good people, and of course we had no idea who he was when we started trying to identify him. So it turned out to be this just crazy, like, Wild West story with, like, bootlegging and, jailbreaks, and, the guy had, like, 10 plus aliases. And so it was so interesting to me to see that, kind of all these forensic experts we still couldn't generate the right post-mortem interval. We were still so far off. And it was also a good personal lesson to me because I thought, well, yeah, I had to have this like kind of personal reckoning with myself. Like, do I only want to solve the cases of good people, or should we try to solve every homicide victim's case? And, I'm firmly in that camp. So, and along the way, of course, I learned much more about genetic genealogy, and I have like the utmost respect for the genealogists who donate their time to work on these cases too. And I think we can all agree that without them, this case would never, ever have been resolved, and we would still not know who Joseph Henry Loveless was, and he would be sitting, in a box on a shelf instead of being identified and having some modicum of dignity, I think, restored to their remains after they've been handled for so long by other people. So that was a pretty satisfying case, and shortly after that, I got involved with a case that we just called Peoria John Doe. And this was another dismemberment case where a torso was found a couple counties away from a severed head. Both were in various states of decomposition. And so I did an examination of the head and some of the ribs. And I tried to give law enforcement a better age estimate using histology, the kind of method that I specialize in. But eventually, it was the same situation where multiple anthropologists looked at the remains, and all we can do is generate an age and sex profile and things like this and tell you what we see on the remains. But if that doesn't match up any missing persons lists, then you're kind of at a standstill. So I recommended law enforcement contact DNA Doe Project on that one too, and that was a pretty quick solve for them. And they found out who that man was, and he was known to be living in like Hawaii, but was from Illinois, and so he was killed in Illinois. And so that's an active homicide investigation, but you can read all about that, about what law enforcement at least released and what I've said online too. Aside from those cases that genetic genealogy was used in, I've been involved in many more cases where genetic genealogy, of course, was not used, because it's kind of a recent development. So I would say the one that sticks out the most to me is a case of a woman named Shannon Siders. She was killed in 1989 in Michigan, and her body was recovered about 6 months after her death. So she goes missing. Nobody sees her, and about 6 months later, hunters recover her partially mummified body in the woods. And I think there's even a Cold Case Files episode on her. But we were briefed by the state police, and we went to the exhumation. We were, of course, going to help with the exhumation to remove the casket from the grave. And there were just these kind of odd elements from the jump. And I don't think I can say much about the actual exhumation, but I can say that we did remove her casket and took it to the medical examiner's office. And when we started looking at her remains, it was very clear that she had blunt force trauma to elements of her skeleton. And I think what was just most kind of interesting to me was to see the sort of process. That was my first time really talking to members of a cold case team. Usually we would get a case in a lab, and it's very far removed from, you might not even ever meet the detective in charge, because you're asked to just do kind of one small piece of a case. And this is the first time where it felt like there was a lot of collaboration. And, I was a student at the time, and so I was just watching the medical examiner with the cold case detectives, knowing that some family members had been at the exhumation, and I thought, okay, this is how you do it. Like, this is how you advocate for a victim in a way that feels like everyone is on board, and that you all, despite how you might even personally feel about each other, or personally, feel about anything, like everyone's focus is on this person and justice for this person. So in that case, we knew who she was. It wasn't a Doe case, but we wanted to know, did the trauma to her remains match up with the information law enforcement was getting when they reopened the case. And in fact, I will say that she was killed by two brothers, and I believe they've exhausted all their appeals, so they'll be in prison for the rest of their natural lives. So her name is Shannon Siders, and her dad should be really credited with keeping her case alive. He would rent billboards in Michigan, and he really put pressure on law enforcement to figure out who had killed her. So I think about her case a lot, and I often think about it when it feels like we have all the information in a case, like if we have a situation where we have the victims, like we know who they are, but we don't know what happened to them. It's like an entirely different kind of clawing at your brain to figure out what happened to them than it is in a Doe case when you're starting with, well, who even is this person, and what happened to them feels like a distant question because you need to know who they are first. So I think that I think of the Doe cases, and I think of those kind of complex cases like Shannon Siders first when I think of the fascinating cases that I've been involved with over the years. But the majority of the cases, like I've said, are these kind of one-offs where we might get a single element washed up on a beach or something recovered from an attic. And I think that the other cases, just if I can speak generally about them, maybe by like theme, that stick with me are child abuse cases and search and recovery cases. So very generally speaking, child abuse cases, the anthropologist gets called in when it appears that maybe, well, aside from trauma, of course, we could weigh in on that, but I've worked on a few where it appears that the biological age of the individual doesn't reflect their chronological age. And so by this, I mean that skeletally, they might look, 5 or 6, and dentally, they might look 8 or 9. So the cool thing about your body is that unless there is something really serious going on, your teeth are going to erupt on a regular schedule despite your nutritional status or despite any abuse that's happening to you. But your bones are, of course, going to slow down, or growth might, you might experience growth cessation. So we can actually compare within somebody's body their dental age to their skeletal age. And then if we know their real chronological age, we can compare all these things and say, well, there is evidence from this body that this individual was suffering some kind of, systematic abuse potentially. And I've been involved in a number of child abuse cases where that forensic anthropology evidence was really critical. There's one in particular that I can close my eyes and like see this young girl's body, and we just she had been identified. We knew who she was. So the answer was not, or the question was not that. The question was, has she experienced abuse? And can you tell that from the teeth and the bones? And we were able to say as soon as we got to the morgue, yes. If she is supposed to be 10, skeletally, she's 5. And the teeth were a mess too. And so those cases feel even different from a Doe case because, you're talking about a child in this case who was killed or neglected at the hands of, an alleged caretaker. And so that kind of fires you up like in a different way, I think. And I know a lot of forensic anthropologists who are, or biological anthropologists who are, they can work child abuse cases from the perspective of a scientist, and I can as well. But I think that those do stay with you. I can't imagine how they wouldn't. They certainly stay with me. And then the last kind of thematic kind of case type, I guess, that I personally really like are search and recovery cases. I think this is mostly because I just like to be away from my office, and I'm a trained archaeologist, so I like going out and excavating. But search and recovery cases are I can't say I've been involved with any that are similar to each other. They're usually pretty different. The one that sticks out in my head recently is, again, another Idaho case, actually. It was search and recovery for a young kid named Dior Coons. And his case has made it to Like, I think there's a People Investigates series about him and all kinds of stuff. But you can certainly look it up. But essentially, we were going out to hike out to see if there was any skeletal evidence left behind at a place where some cadaver dogs had hit on a scent. And so I took a bunch of students out with me, and we had this crazy day, like hiking up this mountain and going to look for these remains, and once we got there, it was all very kind of, it was a really great hike, and then you get to the site and you're like, oh yeah, this is what we're here for. And it was, I was proud of my students because it was kind of this like wave of I don't know, calm and respect that sort of descended. And then we got to work and we didn't find anything that day, and his remains have never been found. But I think that being out in a place where a perpetrator might have placed a body also kind of gives you this added dimension to the work that you do. It's outside of a lab. You're at an actual potential crime scene, if not a crime scene, definitely the potential recovery site. Sometimes they're one and the same, sometimes they're not. And I think that being there physically where somebody either lost their life or where they've been hidden away is something that it feels strange to say it's a privilege, and I don't mean it in any kind of good way, but it is like a weight. I think that I tend to want to share with students and colleagues because it feels like you're very connected to where this person was. And it, to me, I mean, everyone comes at this differently. Certainly, this is just my approach, but to me, that gives me like an added layer of personal connection where I really want to see this case through. And I think that, I cannot just be a scientist. I'm an anthropologist first. I'm a scientific leaning anthropologist, but I care about people first. And so seeing where they were buried or where they lost their lives is always like very, very powerful for me.
So you actually just mentioned your students. So I think this is a good time to talk about the fact that you're also a professor. You're a lecturer at the University of New Hampshire. What kind of classes do you teach there?
So I'm lucky that I get to teach classes that, for the most part, that I've designed and that students seem to respond to. We have a lot of interest at my university, and I think that probably at all the universities I've worked at, around forensic anthropology. So I always teach at least one forensic anthropology class per semester. This coming fall, I'll teach a class that I designed called Bioarchaeology of Women and Children. So this is a class that will be focused on using human skeletal remains and information to ask questions about past gender, kind of from a gendered perspective. So I'm a core faculty member in women and gender studies too. So I like to kind of approach both forensics and bioarchaeology from through a gendered lens as well. I've also taught a class at University of New Hampshire called Cold Cases in Forensic Anthropology, where my students actually divided themselves up into like investigation squads, and they researched a cold case themselves. Most chose to do a local-ish one, and to some really interesting successes. Beyond that, I teach human osteology, so I train students how to use skeletal remains to ask questions about disease and trauma and pathology, age and ancestry. And then I teach a large gen ed on occasion called The Human Story, where we talk about DNA and our human ancestors and evolutionary theory and Darwinism, kind of the underpinnings of the discipline of biological anthropology before we get into sort of the cool subdisciplines of forensic anthro and bioarchaeology and all of that.
So this is related. Is forensic anthropology a popular subject? And if so, what is drawing students toward that field of forensic science?
So I will say that yes, it's a resounding yes. Forensic anthropology is a very popular subject. My classes fill. They usually overfill. I think that in the fall they're having me teach 2 sections because of the demand. So, and I would say that that's the case at any school that offers it. That would be my guess. So it's interesting that you asked what is drawing students towards this field, because we don't know, right? So actually at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meetings, the national meetings, every couple of years people will give a poster or a paper on, why are so many female students interested in this? Because the disparity is there. I would say that my classes are 75+% female. I think in my osteology class, I have 2 males, out of a class of 20. So, yes, it's a popular subject, but it's overwhelmingly a popular subject with women. And your guess for that is as good as mine. I think some of the hypotheses that I've read around that are some of them are are a little short-sighted and kind of based in stereotypes. I think women are just more empathetic. I would hope that we all have the capacity for empathy. I don't think that that's a gender issue. While I don't want students to be like, oh, this is so cool, I'm holding a decomposed hand or something like that. I definitely don't want that. But if they come to my class with that in mind and I can teach them, hey, the more important thing is to have empathy for who this hand belonged to or who this skull belonged to, right? Then that's where my duty and obligation as a professor comes in. But I would say the overwhelming majority of people come because they either saw something on TV and were like, hey, that's kind of cool. I didn't know you could do that with a human skeleton. And then out of that, there are a lot of folks who just like the idea of using the power of science to solve a social issue. And those are definitely the students I want, because that is how I feel. And within that, that feeling that you can use your science to resolve injustices, to give an identity back to somebody, to answer a question for a victim's family. Those all feel very much like noble causes. And so I think that once people understand that forensic anthropology or really biological anthropology in general is about so much more than just picking up skeletal remains and being like, oh, they're cool, what do we do with these? I think that when they actually understand that there are these complex and, in my opinion, extremely important social issues that we can help to resolve, then that's what makes people stay. Are they all going to become anthropology majors? Definitely not. But I love the idea of training folks who are going to go be police officers, who are going to go be lawyers or defense attorneys, or court reporters or whatever. I love the idea of training them to think like anthropologists out in the world.
I know that you and your students sometimes discuss, study, and, as far as I know, even tackle cold cases in class. How do you choose those cases, and do your students' findings ever inform or add to decedent files?
Yeah, so in my cold cases class that ran, last fall, I had about 16 students or so, and I thought about giving them cold cases that I selected that, I just have a personal interest in, to see what they would come up with if they could uncover any new information. And instead, I started thinking that's the wrong way to go about it, at least let's try a semester where they generate the case and see what they come up with. And I think it was way more successful that way, because not only were they working in groups to figure out at the very outset the case that they wanted to cover, but they got really into it from a local perspective. So this is my anthropologist brain coming in here. I was just I want to see what students come up with, because I have students that are mostly from New Hampshire, but also from Massachusetts and Connecticut. But for the most part, I would say they're from New England. And interestingly, of course, they chose all New England cases. And what I will say too is that they, one group, without telling me, they told me much after the fact when I made them tell me why they selected their particular case. They said, well, we wanted to select a case on a missing male, because they felt like we didn't talk about that enough in class. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's a good learning moment for me. I feel like I just kind of gravitate more, I guess, towards Jane Doe cases. But, so I took that as kind of a well-intentioned criticism, and sort of changed up some topics that I teach in class afterwards. But yeah, so they do choose their own cases for the most part, unless I have a case where I have students that I have assigned to work with me on it. But in class, they choose their own case. They choose their own cases, and I would say definitely their findings inform decedent files. And I saw that I was very proud of my last group of students, because they went all in. I mean, one group started a Twitter account for missing persons in the Northeast, and they went all the way back to like 1950, and they have, Twitter updates twice a week, just, putting out information about missing persons. Another group made a great website all about the missing person that they covered. One group did, or two groups did podcasts, and a couple of them interviewed detectives. A couple interviewed an author that was writing a book about one of the cases. And so they went fully in more than I even expected. We also had a couple state police officers come to class as part of a guest lecture, and it ended up being sort of a flipped classroom where the law enforcement was asking the students what information they had come up with. And so that class became so fun to go to twice a week, because it would be like, people would be like bursting with like, oh my God, you're never going to guess what I found out.
So to kind of switch things up a little bit, I want to ask you, what do you wish people knew about forensic anthropology that they don't know?
So I think that students, and I know myself as a student too, come to forensic anthropology or just anthropology in general with a lot of enthusiasm. There is no way that I could say that the students that I work with are not enthusiastic. They are. They want to be in a lab. They want to learn. They want to do casework. They want to do research. And so I think that creates this idea that there are job opportunities. And as we know, in a lot of fields of the humanities and social sciences, sometimes that's not the case. And I think that for forensic anthropology in particular, that's not true. Now, that's not to dissuade anyone from doing this. If they really love it, that's of course what you should do, and you owe it to yourself to try. But if you want to be a forensic anthropologist, the reality is that you will be a professor almost certainly. So if you're, thinking, oh God, I could never picture myself teaching, or research isn't really my thing, this is probably not the field for you. And often I would encourage people to maybe go broader and be a forensic scientist in some other capacity, and not just specialize in anthropology. It's sometimes really tedious casework. Sometimes you get a lot, sometimes you get nothing for 6 months. So if you're okay with those things, then, pursue a degree in forensic anthropology, but understand that, you're going to be doing a lot of things other than casework. And depending on where you're at in the country, you might be doing very little casework. So that's what I wish people knew. I don't divorce myself scientifically from the humanity of what we do. Certainly there are people who can, and that's how they handle it. But I think I should be affected by the sight of a dead body. I think it's strange. It would be strange to me to not think about that, and to not think about victims and their families and the ripple effect that a crime has on either a family or a community. So I think that if you're not prepared for this work to affect you personally, then that might not be the job for you too. Certainly you strike a balance. I don't come home and cry about what I've seen, but I am affected by it. I think that makes me a human being. So there are these things that I feel like we get indoctrinated to believe about forensic science at large, and that's, or maybe even police work, I don't know. But that's, that you have to be have this toughness about you, and that you can't let anything affect you. But that's not, in my case, that's not true. I think about some of the things that I've had to do in terms of forensic casework, or what I've seen. And it's I wouldn't wish that on people who don't want to see it. But at the same time, I feel proud of myself and my students that you can meet that toughness with humanity too. So I think that that's what I would tell students. That's how I teach. That's how I move forward in my scholarship, is with equal parts scientific kind of, the ability to kind of scientifically remove yourself from what's right in front of you, but the parallel ability to bring that back to a human place when it feels very far away from humanity at that time.
So this is just a question that I always wonder. Are there any forensic anthropologists who actually like the TV show Bones?
I think that there probably are. I've actually never seen a full episode, and that's not because I'm like on some high horse being like, oh, I would never watch that. I think it just came on at a time when I wasn't into it or whatever, if Bones brings students in to a classroom, that is, in my opinion, a good thing. More people caring about cases matters. I'm very much not a person who, looks down my nose at people who watch fictionalized versions of, TV crime shows. Why not? Like, if this is something that is, you come to as first entertainment for you, but it makes you think and it makes you want to pursue something professionally or take a class on it to learn more, like, how can that not be a good thing? And I think that students have come up with really good critical questions because they've watched shows like Bones or because they've watched SVU or something like that. And then they come to me and say, like, hey, I saw this on Bones, like, could this actually happen? Or they'll be looking at a case with me or archaeological skeletal remains, and they'll put what they saw on TV and why it can or can't be true, by looking physically at human remains. So I guess I would say I'm pro Bones without ever having seen an episode. Maybe I'll start.
I was not expecting that answer.
I just feel like if a student comes to you and is like, I love Bones, which they tell me all the time, for me to be like, well, this isn't anything like Bones, it just would, if I was 20 years old, that would turn me off. So I try to be like, oh, well, that's cool that it brought you here. Like, here, no, we don't have holograms, but, here's the cool stuff we can do. I think I take the tack or the kind of approach that it brings them in the door, and then we can teach them what we really do.
I have one last question for you. Are there any organizations that our listeners should be learning more about or supporting?
Yeah, I think that, I'll answer this question about, I'll answer it selfishly. How about that? Organizations that I feel like I really care a lot about. One that your listeners might know or almost certainly know kind of thematically about is Sovereign Bodies Institute. And so this is Anita Lucchese and her team who have a database for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. I don't think that can be understated, the importance of that, of having advocates for these databases. And I think that Sovereign Bodies Institute does this amazing work to try to, pull all these threads together. And the reality is, unless we know who is going missing and who is being murdered, you can't begin to investigate. Like, you have to know those figures first. And in the United States, because tribal lands are considered sovereign nations, the state of wherever, Idaho or Wyoming or New Mexico or wherever, doesn't have to keep those figures on Native people who live on reservations. So Sovereign Bodies Institute is a great resource. I really, really admire what that team is doing. I think that if your listeners are interested in using their own DNA to solve crimes, it's worth their time if they've taken Ancestry or 23andMe tests to upload to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA and a website called DNAsolves.com. That's, of course, me glossing over the myriad privacy issues that people have concerns about. But if you're a person like me who, I know about those privacy concerns and they don't bother me, so I've uploaded my DNA on these sites because I don't mind. And so if you're a person who is fine with that, and you've informed yourself about any privacy issues that you potentially feel are an issue for you, then I am an advocate for uploading your DNA. I've just seen it work too many times to not be an advocate for it. But I will say that the caveat to that is that I think that we'll see kind of this play out in the court system in the next 5-10 years or so. But for the time being, it is a reality that this is working.
Special thanks to Amy Michael for joining us for this series. You can hear more from her in Season 8 of The Fall Line, and you'll find a link to the Sovereign Bodies Institute in our show notes. We'd like to thank all the listeners who've taken time to support our sponsors, leave us reviews, or support our show directly on Patreon. We couldn't do it without you. Special thanks to Angie Dodd. The Fall Line is created by Laurah Norton and Brooke Hargrove and is produced and mastered by Maura Currie. Written, researched, and hosted by Laurah Norton, with interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Our research assistants are Kim Fritz, Jessica Ann, Lex Weathers, and Brian Waters. Content advisors are Brandy C. Williams, Vic Kennedy, and Liv Fallon. Theme music is by RJR. You can find Fall Line merchandise in the Exactly Right Podswag store.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.